Hey, what's up YouTube? Goratha here. Today I'm bringing you guys my Linear Champion full build guide. Now, I've played this character a lot over the past week, and I've learned a lot of new things to teach you guys. And I've been asked a lot of questions as well. So pretty much everything that I've been asked, everything I've learned, all the tips and tricks, I'm putting all of that in this video. Now I'm going to give you guys a POV that explains everything about the character. There's a bunch of notes, and I quickly want to talk about how the POV is set up. So we're using different gear sets, different skill tree sets, and different gem sets. You need to make sure that you have the right set on for all three of them. For example, for leveling 1 to 30, you turn the gem set on, turn gear set on, and you turn the skill tree on. This is very important, otherwise you'll get some errors, and if you see an error, then it's not set up properly. I want to give you guys a quick explanation on the POV. And yeah, hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. I quickly want to mention before we get into the video, if you guys like this type of content, make sure you like and subscribe. Most of my viewers are currently not subscribed, and I figured I'd remind you guys because I don't do it that often. Leveling. So like I said, it's a full build guide, and let's get started at the very beginning, the leveling process. So early on, when you're playing a duelist, you actually get all the bow skills you'll need. You have to buy them from the vendor, but pretty easy to get them. Galvanic Arrow comes from the first quest, and you use that until level 12. Use it with Pierce and Mirage Archer. You can try out Momentum instead of Pierce, that's fine. Also, Chance to Bleed is good if you don't have a green. Chance to Bleed is also good. We're also using Shrapnel Ballista. Now, ballistas are very important throughout the leveling process and all the way up until the end game. You could even potentially just continue using ballistas super endgame as well. I'll talk more about that later. Yes, early on, using Shrapnel Ballista. This is also something you can link to Chance to Bleed. You can buy another one off the vendor if you need 2 of them. Once you get that, you can use Dash and Warbanner and Sniper's Mark. Sniper's Mark is acquired at level 4 now, so very early on, you need to make sure you grab that off the Mudflats quest. You can buy Warbanner as well pretty early on. It's also off Mudflats quest, and Dash as well. So all this stuff you can get before you enter Submerged. This is your setup before level 12, and then once you get to 12, you switch to Lightning Arrow. A lot of people like the level as random arrows, but I personally just prefer leveling with the actual skill I'm going to use. And with that in mind, I recommend using Mirage Archer and LMP if you're using Lightning Arrow. Very solid, and you can add in like weapon alien damage later, or Trinity. I'll talk about Trinity and Depth later as well. That's a little bit more advanced and a little bit harder to work in right away. You can switch to Artillery Ballista once you hit level 28. This is off Gervicious, and Artillery Ballista is very, very good. However, Artillery Ballista does not play well with Point Blank, and I'll talk about more about that later when we go over the skill tree. Yeah, basically, Point Blank is not the play with Artillery Ballista. And this is pretty much your setup pre-level 30. You can also use Vitality with Blood Rage. Blood Rage Vitality is pretty good as well. That's an option, or Manaforged plus Frenzy. You get Frenzy at level 16, and Manaforged is level 8. So you can make use of the Manaforged pretty early on, and this is the setup we're going to be using throughout the game as well. Let's see, let's get into the skill tree. So I made some notes here if you guys want to take a look. There's some high priority nodes I recommend while leveling. I'll go through them real quick. Basically, what you're doing is rushing Fairy Bolts early on for some extra proj damage. And then you're going to be going for Onslaught. Onslaught on kill. So the Onslaught gem doesn't exist anymore, but we still have access to Onslaught on the tree, which is very big. And then after that, we go for Farsight, which gives accuracy and Precise Technique. You could probably grab Precise Technique before Farsight if you have Precision. That's an option as well. Once you get the Bow Mastery, you can 100% even without Precision run Precise Technique. And like I said before, Shrapnel Ballista is very, very good with Point Blank. Artillery Ballista actually loses damage with Point Blank, and through a lot of testing and theory crafting, we figured out that it's not really worth having Point Blank, especially endgame. Especially once you get Vengeant Cascade. But early on, this is very solid if you want to have some extra damage before level 28. Past that, you go for Primeval Force and the Invert Mastery. It's have a 25% chance to treat enemy res as inverted. This is very, very insane, especially with Pen. What this means is, if a monster has like 75 resistance, 25% of the time, it'll flip it and be negative 75. This does not scale very well if you have like exposure or like curses that reduce res, but it scales really, really well with Pen. This character is going to be going for Pen throughout the game. Yeah, this is like the early leveling tree. I put Revelry into the passive tree as well. This is in case you want to have extra mana for like Vitality or Precision. It's not required, but if you have mana issues, this is something you can consider as well. Also, don't forget Leech. Leech is very important, especially early on. Also, before I forget, we're helping Alira early on. And later on, we can kill all, but early on, the res and mana regen help quite a bit. Okay, now let's talk about 30 to 68. This is another big part of the leveling process. And the first big thing to talk about is first to strike, last to fall. This will be our first slab. And this is where we can start weapon swapping. Now, weapon swapping turns a lot of people off from the build, but honestly, it's really not that bad, and I'll give you guys some tips to make it a lot less painful. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is using Corrupting Fever with Life Tap and Second Wind. This is in your offhand normally, or like your weapon swap. You can have it in your main links technically, but I would recommend weapon swapping early to get used to it. Make sure you don't over level Corrupting Fever. This is especially annoying early on when you're leveling because your HP gets higher, which forces you to level it up, and you can accidentally level it up too much and take too much damage. The goal is to barely hit yourself below 50%. That way, when you proc Adrenaline, it'll heal you up to like 75%-ish, instead of keeping you at like 50 if you take too much damage from it. Now, I recommend you change your weapon swap keybind to something easy to press, because you're gonna be clicking the weapon swap, using Corrupting Fever, and clicking back. In my case, I use V, and on my weapon swap, I have Corrupting Fever bound to Q. So I press V, Q, V. This weapon swap's in like less than half a second. It's very fast, and it's very easy to get used to. One thing I do recommend, though, is don't put Corrupting Fever on your right click. If you weapon swap and right click, you could be like spamming Lightning Arrow and accidentally like to spam Corrupting Fever, and that's very bad. So I recommend you actually bind it to like one of your actual keybinds, like Q, W, E, R, T, whatever you want to bind it to. Just don't bind it to right click. Now that's out of the way. How do we level and what's changed between 1 to 30 and 30 to 68? So we're still using Lightning Arrow. You can add in, like I said before, elemental damage to attacks or Trinity. I'm going to talk more in depth about Trinity later. You could theoretically be using Trinity this early as well, though. Something to keep in mind if you can fit it in. We're using Artillery Ballista now. I recommend using Focus Ballista. A lot of people don't like this, though. You do have to stand still and attack for this to actually go off. You don't have to use Focus Ballista. You could use something like damage to full life, or, a flat damage gem, like add lightning or add cold. There's a lot of options here. I prefer Focus Ballista. It's the highest CPS, and you're a champion, so you most likely can stand still. And using elemental damage to attacks and Conk Effect. Conk Effect actually seems like it helps the overlapping a little bit, and it's also the highest CPS link in PvP. The Conk Effect is good, I think, for single target. We're still using Manaforged. This is pretty much the setup I use the entire game until I swap to Abyss items, which I'll talk about much later. But basically, Frenzy and Manaforged is pretty nice, honestly, and throw Calling Strike on it. Nice setup. We're using some utility gems. We're using Tornado, which you don't have to use Tornado. I like clicking it on single target. It's definitely a DPS boost, but if you don't like clicking buttons, you don't necessarily have to use Tornado. We can also get a Tornado later on from Crucible, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. The auras. So we're going to be running Haste and Determination. Haste early on is very nice for leveling. I'll quickly talk about how we run Determination. So the tree changes quite a bit once you get to 68. The main things you're looking for to go to on the tree are Master Fletcher, Additional Arrow, really big, and Multi-Shot. So once you have Multi-Shot and Master Fletcher, you can technically drop the LMP. Drop the LMP. Some people like to have more proj, so it's not necessarily a forced thing. Definitely could use LMP for a while if you want. And you're going for Pierce. So Pierce actually might be more important than the other two. You might just go for Pierce first and then get the multi-proj, but you kind of want them all, so that's what you're going for. After that, I recommend getting Charisma. Once you have Charisma, this is when you can run Determination. So if you want Determination earlier, just get Charisma earlier. Also keep in mind, you do want to be grabbing some HP nodes along the way. Definitely don't want to have the 0 HP nodes. So like Herbalism, Bravery, Thick Skin, Revenge of the Hunted, all these are quite good. At some point, you're going to Ranger and grab Form of Nature, Quick Step, and all the good Ranger stuff. Those nodes are pretty efficient early on, too. And Force Nature. Strength and Int issues. A lot of people have had Strength and Int issues while leveling with this character. I recommend early on just taking the Int and Strength nodes on the tree. This should help you until later on when you can get like a pretty good amulet that has like all attributes on it, or something like that. Later on, you can fix on gear. Early on, just fix on the tree. One thing to keep in mind, and a lot of new players make this mistake, do not level your Flame Dash up. You can keep your Flame Dash at super low level, like level 5, 60 Int. Level 15, that's 127 Int. and we don't even get that much endgame. So just don't level your Flame Dash up. Do yourself a favor and keep that low level. Flame Dash is going to be used over Dash at some point, with something to keep in mind. That's 30 to 68, and once you get to Merc and Crow Lab, you're going to be taking Unstoppable Hero and Fortitude. I do recommend you just do Crow Lab when you do Merc Lab, because the first node doesn't really do anything. I mean, you could always get Inspirational and then respec, but that seems like a waste of regrets to me. Something to keep in mind. Next part I want to talk about is early mapping. Now you might have noticed I haven't really talked about the gear at all so far. That's because the gear is pretty vanilla until this point. You're pretty much just looking for flat damage on your bow, wherever with flat damage, just flat damage everywhere you can get it, like gloves, rings, amulet. Any flat damage you get is really good for leveling, and just res and life and move speed. Nothing too impressive. Pretty much just the pre-mapping gear is kind of whatever, honestly. Once you get the maps, though, you want to be keeping an eye out for Perseverance. This is the most important item for the character, and it's actually pretty common, so even if you're playing SSF, you can probably get a Perseverance relatively easily. I would recommend to do Harbinger if you're SSF, though, to get some Ancient Orbs. This makes it really easy to get because, like I said, it's common, so if you Ancient Orb it, you'll most likely get it pretty fast. And Trade League, it's probably like a 1C item at this point, so yeah, buy it as soon as possible, and you'll have a good time. Once you get Perseverance, you actually drop Haste for Grace. Now, Grace is a big defensive bonus. You don't really get hit anymore after you have Grace on, and you get Perma Onslaught from the Perseverance, so you don't really even notice the Haste drop. But you also get a ton of percent damage because you're getting 1% increased attack damage per 200 of your lowest of armor and evasion. And we have like 25,000 armor. Once you get Grace on, the evasion's even higher. Very nice once you get that going. You end Defiance Banner once you get the Uber Lab, which is inspirational. I have it linked to Life Tap currently. That's just how my links are set up. This doesn't actually matter because it's free, so you can unlink it or link it, whatever you want to do. Doesn't really matter once you have inspirational. And yeah, it's pretty much all that changes from the early mapping. This is a good time to talk about the bow and how to craft your bow. So throughout the entire game, the best way to craft your bow is by using essences. Even early on, actually early on while leveling, you just kind of throw out any currency you get at your bow because it's the most important item by far. Find early alchemy, throw it at a short bow. Find early essence, throw it at a short bow. And then pretty much the entire way through. That's how you craft a bow. When you get to maps, you're going to be going for essences as soon as possible. That was pretty much my highest priority on the Atlas tree, was essences. You're going to be using any wrath, anger, hatred, and zeal you find on a bow. Now, the best bow base for this build is Thicket Bow, but Imperial Bow is pretty close as well. And if you want to go crit later on, you want to look for a Spine Bow. But early on, that's what you're going to be doing for the bow crafting. Not too complicated. Honestly, if you get like one Deafening of Wrath and use it on a bow, that'll carry you to, honestly, red maps, so it's pretty easy. Endgame bow crafting. Now, you might think this might be a little more difficult than the early bow crafting, but honestly, it's not really. You just still kind of spam essences. But the difference is now you're looking for a fractured bow to spam on, like +2 fractured arrows would be good, or like any good flat damage roll would be good, and then you spam essences till you have good prefixes, and then you do Crits Can't Be Changed, Veiled Chaos, looking for double damage or double damage while focused, or attack speed, and then you craft whichever one you didn't get. And honestly, that's pretty much a 1500 DPS bow already if you had good prefixes. Crucible passives, and what are we looking out for? The most important ones, in my opinion, are flat elemental damage, elemental modifiers, magnitude, and attack speed. Now, the flat damage always rolls on the first node on the tree, and it goes up 100 plus. It's very, very important. I think it's the most important one, actually. Then you have the modifiers magnitude one. That's just very good in general. That's how you get like your 2000 elemental damage bows. And attack speed. This is another local modifier. So this goes on your bow itself, and it multiplies with the rest of your attack speed on your gear and stuff. So very, very solid. Another notable passes to look out for are shock effect. Now, there is a downside with the shock effect, but we deal with shock later on with the Bestials. So later on, this won't be a problem at all. Shock effect is how you get like those high 50% shocks on bosses. I'll show some footage in this video, and you'll see like the bosses are getting 50% shocked. That's because I have this node and I have Thunderfist. I'll talk more about Thunderfist later, but it's a very important piece to the build as well. Quick want to talk about the Lightning Arrow Crucible node. A lot of people get baited into this node. It doesn't really do that much for this character, unfortunately. But there is a good like skilled node that we can use, and that is Tornado Shot and Split Arrow trigger a tornado. Later on, we might be able to throw in like one of these gems with Manaforge if you get this Crucible passive and just trigger tornadoes with Manaforge. Sounds pretty good to me. I haven't tested it, but something to look out for. Now for the tree. So the tree honestly doesn't really change that much from like the leveling. The main thing you want to keep an eye out for though on the tree now is suppression. So you don't want to get suppression capped once you're in maps. Yeah, you mostly get it on gear, or sorry, you mostly get on the tree. Like you get Inveterate, Quick Step, Intuition. There's an Evasion Mastery for 15% suppression. Yeah, you really only need like 1 or 2 pieces with suppression later on. Like maybe your helmet and boots, and you're pretty much good to go. Suppression's very easy on this character. Very nice. Mark the Prey is very good for single target. If you're struggling, you can probably grab this node and have some extra single target damage. You're going to be grabbing the Leech and like the Leech Mastery at some point. This is very good. You drop the Leech node at Duelist. Yeah, not too much has changed. Also, you can take Watchtowers as well. This is additional totem. I didn't actually even take this when I was playing because I didn't feel like I needed it. But this would be good for single target as well if you're struggling. Okay, now we're done with the leveling process. We can talk about the end game. This is where some interesting stuff comes into play, especially with the gear. Like early on, the gear is kind of whatever. End game, we actually have a lot of different things going on. This is like the most basic end game gear. I have the end game No Abyss gear here. We have the Perseverance, and we have Thunder Fist. So Thunder Fists are really, really good with this character, especially later on when you have Shroud. This is how we're going to have our 5 or 6 link, along with having a Shroud. Now, Shroud only spawns with 2 to 3 sockets out. So you can't put your like Ballista Totem there or your Manaforge there, and you're forced to put it in something else. And Thunderfist is perfect because we get a bunch of ailment effect, and it's also better than a 5 link. This is closer to a 6 link than it is to a 5 link damage wise. So very, very solid, and would definitely recommend it. This is probably the best item after Perseverance. This is like a high priority item for sure. Like I said before, with the bow, you just want flat damage, double damage, attack speed, all that good stuff. And you can see the shock effect mod on the bow, along with the flat and attack speed. This is very, very solid. The quiver, you're looking for additional arrow too, by the way. I just didn't have it on my bow. Additional arrow helps quite a bit. Additional arrow on the quiver eventually would also be really nice. This is like when you can like drop LMP and really not care too much about it. I dropped LMP before I had this, but yeah, it felt fine to me. You're going to need to have a little bit of suppression on something, most likely the helmet. Nothing too crazy going on with the endgame setup until you go for the Abyss items. I'll talk about that in a second. Vengeant Cascade. I quickly want to talk about Vengeant Cascade before we get into the Ballistas versus the Manaforged thing. And yeah, Vengeant Cascade got reworked this league, and it's extremely broken. I would say this is the most overpowered thing currently in the game in terms of like an anoint. It's very, very good. If you would take an anoint that says 100% more damage, that's basically what this does for attack projectiles. Now, this is the reason why we have on PvP set up ×2 arrows, because the way Vengeant Cascade works is you'll shoot an arrow out, it'll hit the monster, it'll return and hit the monster again. Now, obviously that's extremely insane. And one important thing to mention about Vengeant Cascade is you want to have Pierce on the tree. Pierce makes it so your projectile doesn't like fizzle out. It'll actually shoot through the monster and come back. If you don't have Pierce, Vengeant Cascade doesn't work nearly as well. Another important thing is a long shot. You should get long shot on the tree, especially after you get Vengeant Cascade. This will give you damage as the projectile travels further, which will always be the maximum damage on the return. Very good. Something to keep in mind. Now, I went for this on my Alice as soon as possible by getting Blight nodes. I took the Oil Extractor nodes, and the bosses drop Anointed Jewelry nodes. This is a nice technique in SSF especially to get gold oil pretty fast. Basically what will happen is you'll get oil extractors from random oil chests that you do blights and maps from, and sometimes bosses will drop already anointed jewelry. And a lot of the time, or a decent amount of time, it'll drop anoints that have like gold oil on them, and you can extract one of those oils and potentially get a gold oil. This is very, very solid and a pretty good way to get gold oil. I recommend getting Vengeant Cascade as soon as possible. Very high priority. Now, getting back to Ballistas versus Manaforged, the reason why this is important is because I don't think you should run a Manaforged setup unless you have Vengeant Cascade. Ballistas are still more damaged than the Manaforged setup, but with Ballistas, they have a couple of downsides. They have a lot of screen clutter. They die quite a bit on harder content. For example, anytime you're doing like a boss, it has AoE. You're doing like basically anything that has AoE damage, like essences sometimes kill Ballistas really fast. So if you don't like spamming the Ballistas every time they die, the Manaforged setup might be the play for you. Now, in my current Manaforged setup, I'm using Burning Arrow with Manaforged, obviously, and Inspiration. Now, I guess I should talk about how Manaforged works real quick. Manaforged is a trigger that triggers off your main skill. So, like, you don't link your skill to Lightning Arrow, but, like, your Lightning Arrow will proc the Manaforged. Now, this happens whenever you spend enough mana to trigger the Manaforged. So, in our case, we attack twice with Lightning Arrow, and it'll trigger our Manaforged setup. I currently have 2 Manaforged setups. One in my gloves with Thunder Fist for damage, and the Frenzy with Cull. Now, these don't share cooldowns, so you can trigger them both at the same time. And this triggers, like I said, after you spend an amount of mana. And we have Inspiration currently linked to it to lower the mana cost to actually guarantee we trigger it every single time it's up. So it has a cooldown of 0.5 seconds, and we want to make sure that we actually have casted enough mana to proc it every 0.5 seconds. Without Inspiration, it was a little rough, and sometimes I would like miss an attack and the mana cost wouldn't be there. There's something else to consider though. When you have Inspiration, you're doing a bit less damage because the Manaforged gem itself gives 1% more damage per 1 mana cost. That's something to keep in mind. That's why I'm using Inspiration though, just to make sure that I trigger on cooldown. The reason for Burning Arrow. Now, Burning Arrow has the highest damage effectiveness out of any bow skill. Now, this is by a significant amount, and it also has a bunch of flat damage against ignited enemies. Normally, the downside here is that the attack speed on Burning Arrow is quite slow, but since we're triggering it with Manaforged, we don't actually have that downside. We avoid it completely. It's very, very solid. And the other link, we're using Ellie Pin. Ellie Pin is just a really good damage link. It's something you should use in your Lightning Arrow setup as well later on. Ellie Pin or Hyperthermia will be the best link later on. Hyperthermia, if you have enough cold damage to chill, is slightly better. But Ellie Pin is very, very solid. This is better than Lightning Pin in almost all cases, assuming you have any other damage on your gear. Trinity. So I'm quickly going to take the time to explain how Trinity works. I've been mentioning it the entire time. Trinity is a very, very good support gem. It's most likely the highest DPS on your main Lightning Arrow links throughout the entire game. Unfortunately, it's a bit complicated for new players, and it's not always the easiest to set up. I'm going to try to explain it to you real quick, though, and hopefully you guys can understand. Trinity procs Resonance based on the highest damage type of the skill. If you hit for mostly lightning damage, it'll proc Fire and Cold Resonance. If you hit for Cold, it'll proc Fire and Lightning Resonance. Whenever you have all 3 Resonance, you have the most benefit out of Trinity. So what this means is you can actually trigger Trinity by having just lightning damage and cold damage, for example. The really cool part with lightning skills especially is lightning damage has a really, really high damage range. For example, on our Lightning Arrow, we have like something like 1,000 to like 20,000 lightning damage. So sometimes we'll be hitting for like 18,000 lightning damage, or proc the Fire and Cold Resonance, and sometimes we'll hit for like 2,000 lightning damage. But we also have like 4,000 to 6,000 cold damage. So anytime we hit for that low lightning damage amount, we'll do mostly cold damage on that attack. So that'll proc the Fire and Lightning Resonance. So in that case, we actually get Trinity from the same skill, and it just works automatically, which is very solid. Very good in its character, especially if you just get like flat damage on your bow. Like for example, my bow has both flat damage, like lightning and cold, and fire, but you only need one of the two to make it work. And yeah, it's very, very solid, and I think you should run it as soon as possible. Now, one big mistake I saw a lot of new players making is they were running Trinity with their Ballistas, or putting in Manaforged. Now, Trinity only works on your main attack. It doesn't work with totems, it doesn't work with triggered skills. It's very limiting. It's very strong, but also very limiting. So we can only run it in our main Lightning Arrow links that we're actually self-attacking with. Basically, that's all I wanted to talk about with the Trinity. So one thing you guys may have noticed is I'm no longer running Voice of the Storms in this character. And the main reason for that is, first off, it's super rare, and it was kind of hard for me to get one in hardcore. But the more I thought about it, the more I decided it probably wasn't worth it in the end. Like, just a really good GG rare will probably end up just being better. Just because, yeah, it's really hard to put Trinity in with Voice. Voice makes your lightning damage lucky, which makes it so it rolls the damage twice. This guy doesn't interact very well with Trinity, and Trinity is our best damage link. So I feel like Voice of the Storms was just not worth it in the end. That's why I'm not using it. The end game. So we're finally getting to the end game trees, and we're going to talk about the Abyss items, the Thread of Hope, the cluster setup. Let's get into that. The Thread of Hope. You're looking for a large Thread of Hope. It goes into the ranger slot. This hits everything. This hits literally 8 nodes you're taking on the tree. It takes Quickstep, One of Nature, Ask of the Eagle, Primeval Force, Master Fletcher. It hits piercing shots and multi-shot. It also hits King of the Hill if you go crit. This hits literally everything, and it saves you like 10 plus points. Now, those 10 points had damage on them, so you're not like getting free 10 points. It's still like opportunity cost, right? But this allows you to run a cluster setup, which is definitely better than those 10 points. And some of the better nodes are like Martial Prowess, Calamitous. You can run like the Exploding node, I forget what it's called, but Drive Destruction's not bad either. And then you can run a medium cluster as well, with like Eye to Eye and Streamlined. Basically, it's a bunch of damage, and you get 2 more Abyssal sockets, which is really good once you switch to the Abyssal items. Now, the main reason why we're running Thunderfist is because the Shroud of the Lightless. I'm not sure if it can still spawn with 1 socket, but for the most part, I've only seen it with 2 and 3. Now, what this means is you definitely have to use Thunderfist. I talked about this a bit earlier, but this is the main reason why we're using Thunderfist. To put the Ballista or Manaforged into the gloves. And yeah, Shroud's really good now. It gives you 10 per Abyssal Drill affecting you and % life per Abyssal Drill affecting you. It's also really, really good to grab Ghost Dance. Now, we need Ent anyways, so getting these Ent nodes isn't that bad. But before you get Shroud, you don't necessarily have to take Ghost Dance. I think it's worth it. But yeah, it's definitely worth it when you have Shroud, because Shroud gives you like 600 ES, and yeah, your evasion is really high, so you're getting all of that ES back every time you get hit. Very, very solid. Bubonics. So Bubonics are really cool now. They give you Reservation if you have a unique Abyssal, and they give you Move Speed with a Magic Jewel. You're going to want to fit in like a res, like damage Magic Jewel. You're going to want to get Olmon's Gaze. This gives you the Chain on Terrain. Very solid as well. The main reason you're running Bubonic is to run another 50% aura. So once you get Bubonic, you actually get Anger. Now, Anger is very solid. The main reason you're running Anger over Wrath, for example, is because Wrath takes 150 int, and Anger does not. Anger is like 100 strength, 70 int, which is pretty much what you already have. Now, you can use a Unset Ring with additional levels to juice up the Anger a bit, get some more damage. Very, very solid. Yeah, it's the main reason for the Bubonics. You could also run Purity of Elements with Bubonics if you got it early on, because Res is a big problem in fitting in the Abyss items. Res is like the main bottleneck. I actually never made it to this before my character died, actually. I'll show you guys the rip clip in a bit, but yeah, my character did end up dying. I never actually made it to the Abyss setup. But yeah, it's a lot of res. I never actually got the amount required. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, ailments. I do want to talk about Pantheons and ailments real quick. This is like something I didn't talk about yet. We're pretty much running Brine King the entire time. It's for freeze immunity, and it gives us reduced chill as well. Goratha can be taken early on for reduced shock effect, but we eventually want to become shock immune through Abyss Jewels. I currently have 80% avoid shock on 2 Abyss Jewels, like 2 Abyss Jewels giving me 80% avoid shock, and we get the last 20% from thick skin nodes. That's why I have all 4 of these, is just giving me my shock immunity. It's really good in combination with the bow, because the bow has a downside when you have shock effect, that has increased shock effect on you. This is how we're getting around that. Very, very solid. I'll give you guys my Alice tree, it's in the POB notes here. If you guys want to see exactly what I did. I mentioned it throughout the video, how I planned my gear out and how I actually crafted most of my gear. This will give you the actual Alice tree. And I wanted to mention real quick, you can theoretically scale this further endgame if you want to go Omni and Crit. Now, I didn't do that, and that would require a lot of investment, and it would be a completely different build. But it's something you can go for at some point if you want to switch to Omni and go like a Crit with like a Spine Bow or something like that. Spine Bows can roll with like base Crit and like Brittle and stuff. But yeah, that's for another time. It's not in this build guide, but something to keep in mind. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I spent a lot of time on the POB, and I spent a lot of time making this video. Hope you guys enjoy this type of content, and hope you guys have a good league. Oh, the boss. What kind of boss is this? Oh! Yo, he one-shot me. Well. Ooh.